But David, you know what? Because a bunch of commenters are now going to say I'm cowardly for not taking your bet, I'll take your bet at 5-1 odds.
Okay.
I'll just come along and drink whoever's scotch wins.
Hi, I'm Ed Whittingham, and you're listening to Energy versus Climate, the show where my co-host David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and I debate today's climate and energy challenges. They say there's no growth without feedback. In this past season, you've given us plenty of it across a variety of social media and podcast platforms, and even through good old email. So we decided to lean into the growth opportunity and read and respond to some of what you sent our way. Some of your comments are positive, some additive, and let's just say some were strongly suggestive. So without further ado, here's the show. Hey everyone, today we're here with a bit of a different episode. Instead of us telling you what we think, we're starting with what you think. And that's straight from the comment sections of our various social channels. Some of your comments are sharp, some are wrong, some are a little insulting, but that's fine. And some are a combination of all of them. So we're just going to get straight into it. I think of this one as our own Mean Tweets show. So this first segment, I call this first segment, I Hate EVs. Here's one that's short.
And I didn't know that.
Oh, yes. Well, it's funny. I guess I'm a self-hating EV owner then. Here's one from Diex, and it reads, EV is good only for warm weather, not in cold climate. Sarah, you picked this one. What do you think? You drive in Calgary winters in EV, so what is your thinking?
Well, I mean, I have sympathy because I prefer warm weather to cold climates. But what I'll say about this is there is a differentiation, and an important one, I think, between doesn't work and works with lower range. So I think one of the common misconceptions that I hear from people who are even not EV haters necessarily is that they're concerned about, is my EV going to work when it's minus 30? And the answer to that is a resounding yes. I think it's the mechanics of a electric motor versus the complexity and mechanics of a internal combustion engine are more reliable at cold temperatures. What is true, however, is that the range is lower for the batteries that we have today. And again, there's nuance. If you're driving your EV around town, you're not really going to notice much of a difference. You'll have to, charge a little bit more frequently. Similarly, if you have enough infrastructure to go longer distances, again, you're going to have to be doing more charging if you're driving in the winter. I think it is fair, and we do have to admit that for some of the real long distance driving in very cold places like Alberta, we are a bit at the limit, right? So if you want to go, skiing frequently in your EV to far destinations in Alberta, may or may not be the best choice depending on, how much you want to deal with charge management. But I think it's important for us to remember, the majority of people in the world do not live in places that get this cold. So I think we'll, continue to see improvements, and the experiences that come from Alberta, while manageable on a day-to-day basis, certainly people can come up with use cases where an EV isn't going to be the best option today.
I'll just jump in to say I concede there certainly is a challenge. So my wife frequently is driving from our home in Canmore to her folks in Okotoks. And in the new GM EV that we have, in the summer, going back and forth on one charge is no problem. But in the winter, it doesn't quite work. So totally agreed. Things work, but range is reduced. One thing to say is that technological change really is happening. So sodium is being introduced instead of replacing lithium in similar chemistry batteries. And these things have gone from something that was really purely academic to being deployed in the North America already for energy storage, and being now entering production chains for EVs, and expecting they will be in EVs sold in North America within a year or two. And sodium batteries basically suffer no degradation at all in the cold. So I think change is happening, and that's even forgetting the thing that's one step further away, which is solid state batteries, which are supposed to charge much faster and always also would not be much affected by cold as far as I know. So this is not a permanent fact of EVs. It's fact of the current lithium-ion chemistry.
And as an EV owner, so yes, I too suffer from the minus 30% range or something in that order during the coldest days. Now, Norway has the worst winters of any country with serious EV adoption, but also the highest EV adoption on Earth. So if cold kills EVs, no one told the Norwegians. And lastly, I think you need to do an apples to apples comparison because gas, like internal combustion engine vehicles, they lose winter efficiency as well. It's just invisible because they don't display your range the same way that EVs do. So it's a lot less noticeable. But listen, I think we've covered that one well. We're still in the I hate EVs segment. Let's go to Aaron Rude. And I love the last, I have no idea if it's his actual last name. He says, please explain where all the power is going to come from to support these vehicles, meaning EVs. The infrastructure is 20 years behind these goals.
I did a bit of math that I can talk through to start. So if we look for, because I think that's helpful to understand. And what it really comes down to is that the amount of electricity that we're talking about on a general scale is not all that significant compared with what we generate today. So in Alberta, for example, if you were to electrify all registered motor vehicles, that's almost 4 million vehicles today, a little bit under, you'd be talking about somewhere around 11 terawatt hours for a year. So, is that big? Is that not big? That's about 13% increase of our total electricity use in Alberta today. And it's important to remember that we're not talking about doing this tomorrow. As you start to change over the fleet, you will certainly have time to build out more electricity. The real, I think, more challenging part that, again, there's solutions for is that when exactly that charging comes matters. But again, there's a lot of opportunities to do so-called demand flexibility, basically the idea that you don't necessarily care all that much when your EV is charged as long as it is charged. And again, this is not a sort of theoretical, magical thinking, but you look at places like the UK and others that have started to implement this at scale. And what they're finding is that they can get quite a lot of flexibility to be able to smooth out peaks in demand and even respond to different shapes in supply by incentivizing people with lower cost EV charging.
That's a great answer for Canada. Also remember Canada is an outlier with renewables being, at least solar, being comparatively harder in Canada and colder temperatures. Lots of the world where most of demand are places where it's much easier to have solar capacity with diurnal batteries. And so there's a much more obvious answer about how we expand the grid to power EVs.
Sure. And infrastructure planning is always behind till the year it isn't. Think of cell towers in 2008. And it's local. You can't make a blanket statement about that, but, regulators and utilities do and can underbuild. So I think the planning risk failure is real, even if it's a bit of a doomer statement. Okay, next one. John Waynes _teeth says, my entire community is powered by diesel, 3.25 million liters per year. Roughly, it has a free government-funded charging station installed downtown. While I'd never want to miss a chance to dig on Alberta, I also think we need to be realistic about where our infrastructure is across the country before getting smug about EVs. Well, I will start, but just saying the free charger that perhaps no one asked for and where diesel generators are running, that's kind of like performance art. This is sometimes where I think climate policy makes the mistake of delivering a symbolic win instead of a substantive one. And the real issue is not how people are getting around. The real issue is that's a community running on diesel, which is expensive and polluting, and they should be focused on other ways to get off diesel. Yeah,
I think the only thing I'll add to that is, again, we should be realistic in our discussions about kind of let's call it the last 5% of decarbonization, which is going to be undoubtedly, by far the hardest part. And so I would include in that, addressing EVs in non-grid connected communities, which is not to say that, things can't be done. And I think there's a lot to do, around getting communities off diesel for a lot of other great reasons. But, it is fair that that last bit and some of these edge cases are going to be the most difficult.
Great. Let's go to the next one. Croaky Joe. says oil is going nowhere, EVs are going nowhere. There isn't going to be a wholesale switch to EVs anytime soon. They will simply occupy part of the market, no different from diesel vehicles. The idea that one will replace the other in short time is naive. And David, Croaky Joe makes what is actually kind of a reasonable structural argument about EVs will be part of the market, not the whole market. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think it all hangs on what a short time is. So if we're talking years, then of course he's right, but nobody sensible is. I think that if we're talking the next couple decades, I'm pretty confident he's wrong. That is, I think it's very likely that EVs will eat into a bunch of the oil market that's used for light-duty transportation. Indeed, I would expect that over the next decades, we're going to quickly see a world where more than half of vehicle sales for light-duty vehicles are EVs. And then, run that out a decade, that means the fleet is shifted, and that takes a whole bunch of that oil demand away. And I don't think it magically gets replaced. So I really do think that EVs will eat into oil demand. Of course, not everywhere. There will still be oil demand for light-duty vehicles in specific places and oil demand for aircraft and so on, out to the foreseeable future. But I do think he's wrong unless by short term you mean years.
Great. Let's go to the next one. And this is about Canada imports batteries. EVs make more sense in China. Jeff Russ 6787 says a country with oil versus a country without oil. China imports all of its oil. Canada imports all of its batteries. Electric cars make sense in China, but not so much in Canada unless used strictly for in-city commuting.
So I think that, again, a lot of these comments, what's interesting to me is they have a sort of kernel of truth to them, but then the conclusion that's drawn from it, I think, is incorrect. So, yes, China as a oil importer has even more kind of economic and energy security reasons to want to move to EVs. However, I don't think that Canada has an anti-case just because we're an oil exporter. And I think there's two reasons for that. One is, as we've seen right now, for anybody that's filling up at the pump, oil is very much a global market and Canada is very much exposed to global prices. So, barring some kind of national energy program that sets costs for oil across the country, which, it's interesting to hear unusual suspects asking for that now. But barring that, Canada's status as an oil exporter does not mean that, we don't stand to gain in terms of protecting consumers from inflation by moving to electrification. And then the second thing I'll say is that around batteries, it's not a one-for-one replacement with batteries and the oil in cars. I do think certainly as we see larger and larger shares of our energy system become electrified, we do need to think about energy security and diversity in supply chains for things like batteries. There's a slightly different calculation in terms of if you have an internal combustion engine vehicle, you need fuel the next day when it runs out of fuel. If you have a battery electric vehicle, once you have the battery, and it's all about the local electricity that you put into it. It's longer term planning. And, frankly, it's using the same kind of tools that we use for oil, right? I mean, we're living through that now. Countries have strategic oil reserves that help provide energy security in cases where there's kind of global crises that lead to problems there. So I think those same kinds of mechanisms can be deployed in countries like Canada, and I think will be as we move further into the energy transition.
Yeah, it's a bit ironic. I suspect this person is a Western Canadian because if you've paid attention, there have been lots of federal Ontario announcements about building an EV supply chain, especially in Ontario. So it's a little less, exporting oil versus not. And it's more, will that supply chain actually ever pick up and produce economic output comparable to Canada exporting oil? And who knows? I doubt it, but maybe it will. Okay, so our next segment we call Nuclear Power is Awesome. A bunch of people arguing for the merits of nuclear power. A commenter with a username it's just a bunch of user and digits, so I'll just go with that. Makes a detailed case for nuclear over wind in terms of capacity factor, reliability, bird deaths, infrastructure footprint. David, you've thought a lot about this. Without reading the whole comment, what are your thoughts?
Pretty much each of the specific factors that the user says strike me as correct. There are all sorts of ways in which nuclear power is clearly better when it's built and working. But what the user didn't say is that, at least in the Western world, we basically don't know how to build nuclear power. That's a slight overstatement, but not a big overstatement. And that reality is unavoidable. There might be ways to fix it, but if you look at all of the recent builds in the Western world, they're all going way over time in budget, in some cases outrageously so. So what I think we know is that we used to be able to build nuclear power. The US built up a big fleet, for example, and the costs at the time were quite reasonable. And China is now able to build nuclear reactors roughly on time and on budget, and things working well. And it's obviously possible for us to do it because we did. But right now, I think it's fair to say we don't know how to. And so the counterpoint to the user's statement is that there needs to be real changes in the regulatory structure and the business structure to enable these bills to happen in a reasonable way in the Western world, or the user's comments are irrelevant, even if they're correct.
Yep. And the world is watching it. As we talked about with Jason Donoff a few weeks ago, we do have new nuclear build underway in Canada. It's the Darlington SMR project using the BWRX 300 reactor. They've set a blindingly fast production schedule in under 5 years, and the world is watching. If they're able to deliver that on time, on budget, then the order book will fill up. If they can't, then the order book will not fill up.
Ed, I will bet you a bottle of the nicest scotch that we can buy in Canmore at, no, I needed to have a way at like 5-1 odds. Basically, five bottles to one. Would you take the bet that they'll do it on time?
No, because I think it's too fast. It's under 4 years. But would they do it, say, with 20% time overrun? So I would say,
I think that's the big question.
Under 6 years, I'd take that bet.
I sure hope they can do it better. But I think at present, as things stand, looking at the actual reactors under construction in the Western world, you just have to say it doesn't look good.
Yeah. But David, you know what? Because a bunch of commenters are now going to say I'm cowardly for not taking your bet. I'll take your bet at 5-1 odds.
Okay.
I'll just come along and drink whoever's scotch wins.
Oh, perfect. Perfect. Well, a bit of a segue. The next one we call The Woman is Delusional About Cost, because Mr. Imaginative 3 says, this woman is delusional about the cost. The most efficient energy is nuclear. End of story. And we think he was referring to you, Sarah. So are you delusional about cost?
I'm certainly delusional about some things, like thinking, watching the World Cup, that like I could still go out and play soccer. So I'm not going to claim I have no delusions. As far as costs, though, I think I'm pretty well supported by the data. So, we can talk about what costs you want to look at. Certainly, if you look at just pure LCOE for solar, the costs are becoming minuscule compared with that of nuclear. If you want to make it a little bit harder and add in batteries so that you turn that solar into something that's a bit more available, kind of 24/7 in most climates around the world. A recent report from Ember pegs the cost of doing that, somewhere in the range of $100 to $130 a megawatt hour, compared with, if you could build it nuclear around 175. So, the reality is no electricity system is going to run on a single source of power, but it is no longer the case that nuclear has even this theoretical, massive cost advantage over something like 95% available solar plus storage.
Yeah, I think the commenter is delusional because it's no secret. Nuclear is a lot of things, but cheap isn't one of them. And by most independent cost analyses, it's the most expensive electricity out there, but you get other benefits for that expense. Okay, continue.
I want to push back a little bit. I think it's not, doing solar with enough batteries to really be seasonal 724 dispatchable in Alberta, I think would be certainly more expensive than nuclear in China. That's the point, we don't know how to build that nuclear here.
I think that's fair. I think, again, we have to remember as you are, differentiate between solar in Alberta and solar elsewhere, and then the real costs.
This next comment builds on what you're just talking about, David. Candy 10022 says South Korea builds nuclear reactors within budget and on time. So we could have a separate bet on some South Korean reactor build. And the reason why nuclear reactors are so expensive is because we have a deep state that makes the process so expensive. I'll take a crack at this one. I mean, you don't need a deep state to explain it. It's just a spreadsheet. Like Korea builds reactors 8 to 12 times in a row. In Canada, going forward, we're running the risk of building a different reactor. Korea gets all the advantages of standardization in the same way that China now is forcing standardization on its new nuclear. And you're seeing the costs as a result. I think we're getting now costs coming in South Korea, they're like $2,200 a kilowatt. And as we know, started in the US, it starts from $6,000 a kilowatt and goes up from there. So I think they've really captured standardization, and that's something that Canada has to pay attention to. Why we're moving away from can-dos? Well, that remains to be seen.
Estimates in China put costs of the current builds at, something of order $70 a megawatt hour. And in sunny places, solar plus battery backup can actually be cheaper than that. But in other places, solar plus battery backup would be a lot more expensive. And I think the question is, can other places replicate those costs?
I do want to pick up on the deep state piece, because I actually think I would characterize the issue more as a lack of state capacity on Canada's part and others in the West. And, as any fan of Korean skincare products know, they are innovating faster and their regulators are working better to bring innovation to the market than I think we see happening in North America. So, what's true for skincare, I think is true for energy in this case as well, too.
Yeah, I mean, it really is. The difference is South Korea isn't letting its welders retire in between builds. But Canada right now, that mentioned the Darlington SMR project, that's 27 years after we built the last nuclear unit in Canada. So a lot of the skilled trades have simply retired in that time. Okay, next segment we call Nuclear Power Sucks. So now we're going to hear from the anti-nuclear folks. And the first one is ex-Spanish Manx. Equivocating battery waste to nuclear waste and then framing it as worse than nuclear waste seems disingenuous. I think this was directed at you, David.
I don't think it's disingenuous. I think it's accurate and practical environmental analysis. So if you actually look at the risk estimates or observed risks so far from the temporary nuclear waste storage we have, or risk estimates from the nuclear waste storage we're talking about, the risk estimates that we're debating in some of these storage are the idea that somebody 100,000 years from now who drinks water from a well that's most contaminated has cancer rates that are barely at background. And you don't have to travel far to see places where battery waste is much more severe. The existing challenges of lead acid batteries contaminating people and damaging especially children's brains neurologically are already very real. So I think the answer is just look at the environmental evidence. Actual damage and expected damage from the metals involved in battery production are significantly higher than what we expect from nuclear waste.
Erwin Dreesen added a comment. This was during the webinar with Jason Donev, and he said about waste, if managing the waste is such a non-problem, how come most of the countries that have nuclear reactors are still looking for solutions after 60 years?
So no country is now operating a permanent regulated nuclear waste repository. I think that's because, for a lot of reasons, including worries that are legitimate about nuclear war, worries about the nuclear industry lying, which it has, worries about it not being economically efficient, which are legitimate since it hasn't been in lots of places, Interveners who were skeptical for good reasons about nuclear power have chosen to intervene in the waste process in ways that have made it not complete. And government has been weak and failed to complete it. And most of all, the U.S. has some particularly terrible things, both politically and technically, about their waste storage decision. And that, because the U.S. is important in the press, it tends to kind of overwhelm other ones. So I think there are lots of reasons why nuclear waste storage has been fraught, but I don't think they're about the fundamental technical difficulty or cost.
Yeah, and I think Irwin's after 60 years still looking for solutions point actually needs an update, because at the end of this month, that's not going to be true anymore. Finland's Onkalo site could be receiving a spent fuel by the end of the year. I think Sweden's not too far behind. And here in Canada's further along than, saying still looking for a site. We've got the Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation and the town of Ignace, I believe, that they partnered. And so we're finally seeing deep geological storage projects getting done. Let's go to the next one. Brian Hope says, the fact is, nuclear was sold as energy too cheap to meter by engineers and proponents who just wanted to siphon off taxpayer money. The estimates for projects were wildly understated. Final costs were 5 times as high as the estimates, and that doesn't include ongoing costs and the costs of storing waste. And I will say, too cheap to meter, that was a real quote. That's real history. And I think it came out of the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission. And I do remember growing up as a kid in Ontario, there was some talk about that nuclear assets, nuclear units in Ontario would make electricity too cheap to meter. And of course, that never came to bear.
We do, of course, see it now. I just saw the latest an ad for, I think it was dishwashers and washing machines that are sold in Europe from, this is not an ad, but I think it was like Siemens and Bosch, where they've partnered with the utility and you get free dishwashing and free laundry if you agree to link it to your, utility and have it run at a certain time a day. So it is interesting to see that, in some way we are starting to end up with a version of too cheap to meter, or at least willing to give away for free electricity all these years later.
Yeah, and I do think we need to acknowledge that overselling has done real damage to nuclear's credibility, and that damage is still playing out today. We talked about new builds happening in places like China and South Korea coming on time, on budget. And again, we'll see what happens here, but it definitely is a real issue, and I can understand why there's so much distrust out there. And we talked about the unlearning curve with Jason. When each successive project becomes more expensive than the last one, that's going the opposite direction. The ratepayer bears the cost. People get upset and they get skeptical. Okay, let's go on to segment 4. And this is solar power is a joke. So Bill Hudson says, and this is, I guess, where our solar is going to, our solar wins everything, or wins all show, and directed at Sarah. You got to be kidding. Solar power is a minuscule power source and completely uneconomic.
Well, we touched the uneconomic, so I'll focus on the first part. And I'll agree, solar is a very tiny power source. It's actually a quantum, level process where you're kicking out electrons inside silicon semiconductor. But I don't think that is what Bill was talking about here, rather about the scale of deployment. So I looked up a few facts for this one as well, too. 2 key ones, I think, that are interesting. Solar and wind together. So you can say maybe I'm cheating a bit here, but solar and wind together hit a milestone in April of this year where they generated more power globally than natural gas for the first time in history. So, that's a scale question. And I think a lot of this really comes down to just how quickly this has grown and how easy it is, if you're not watching the stats, daily, to be shocked by this stuff. So I've got one more stat for you, which is in 2011, which happens to be the year my kids were born, there was 64 terawatt hours of solar globally. Now, play that forward. You would have looked at my 5 pound and change children in 2011 and said, they're minuscule. They can't lift anything. They've grown maybe about 3 times in height and 5 ish times in weight. They are much stronger than I am now. Over that same period, solar grew 43 times in generation. So it's up around 2,700 terawatt hours in 2025. So much like Bill would be shocked if he met my kids for the second time today, I think he is really just maybe not totally up to date on the scale of solar generation today.
Just to add on a connection to the last conversation and agree violently with Sarah, you can't argue with numbers. It's solar is now almost equal with nuclear net generation, and it'll only be a couple years at current trajectories before it surpasses nuclear for a global net.
Yeah, and minuscule is a strange word for a source of power that just helped two European countries in Spain and Portugal get to 40% of the grid. So no longer minuscule. Okay, that was a one comment segment. The next segment is the opposite. Solar power is awesome. I'm going to go to Ikiko Taco. He says, okay, but solar also doesn't need to take up land. It takes up space for sure, but there's ways to mitigate that. For example, solar films and panels on existing buildings and fences, over canals and fisheries, power plants in space, beaming a laser back to Earth. And I think, David, this is in a response to you. And a couple times you've said, hey, yeah, we have to acknowledge that solar power is land intensive.
Well, you can't have everything. So the comments about buildings coated with solar, the answer is it just doesn't scale at a reasonable cost. So yes, it's true. And solar on big industrial warehouses is great, but it's just not at the scale you need to really power a big chunk of industrial civilization. If solar was confined just to being on buildings, it would be confined to being a minor energy source. If we're going to do solar at scale, it needs to be taking up land, kind of order 1% of the whole Earth's surface if we're going to power a big chunk of industrial civilization on it. That's a trade-off I think is worth making, but it's not nothing, and it really will have environmental impacts. Of course, it's true that in principle, solar could be in space and beam down. People have talked about this for decades. There's nothing fundamentally hard about it, but it's not close to being in the market now. So, but looking over the century, it's certainly a possibility.
Yeah, I mean, stuff takes space. I think what matters is, is it a amount of space that we potentially have to use? And I think, we use a lot of space now to grow corn to generate energy, which is wildly inefficient compared with using that same space for land. I do think that there are some, really interesting examples. There's a not insignificant new project in California where they are covering indeed some of the canals that move water around the state with solar panels. And it's a real win-win because you are also protecting that water from evaporation. So I think this is a matter of, yes, we should look for opportunities to integrate solar in ways that, repurpose or use land. And we should not, stop using other land for solar as well, too.
To give people a sense of the actual numbers, a square meter of average land, not worrying much about where it is, will generate something like 10 watts on average of solar power, and would generate an average something like 1 watt of wind power or hydropower. Again, it depends, of course, on the dam and so on, and would generate much under a watt of power from biofuels, and would generate more like 100 watts of nuclear power, even counting all the uranium mining and all the infrastructure. So that range gives you a sense of what the land use is for different energy sources.
Yeah, I think maybe the solar industry has to sort of more frequently acknowledge the land footprint as an issue, but our provincial government here in Alberta has certainly used the land footprint as a cudgel to beat renewable electricity developers senseless.
But I think I kind of rattled those numbers off in a way that might not have been very digestible. I think the point is solar is better than all the other major energy sources except nuclear. It's substantially better than wind for land footprint and much better than biofuels or hydro.
Just on space solar, I gather that in a DARPA test that they're able to beam a laser across 8.5 kilometers and producing 800 watts, which is like enough to power a hairdryer. So maybe it'll come sooner than we think. It's a pretty neat experiment.
go watch Real Genius if you want to see that gone wrong. I know that that's not what the space solar people are doing now. I just I can't help but think of that movie. But I actually think the space solar, I've done a little bit more looking into it recently, and it does seem like a real potential. I think one of the biggest barriers or question marks is, can you really get bigger, heavier payloads launched at competitive costs? And there, I'm not a space scientist, so I leave that to others.
Yeah, I mean, it's more to say how far away this is. I mean, right now, space data centers would be the first practical application, and they're still a long way off. The cost of getting to orbit has certainly fallen a lot, but even if orbit access was free, the costs of doing the power beaming would still make it pretty hard to compete with land-based solar.
Yep. Well, it's neat to see as part of the IPO price of SpaceX last week was buoyed by people anticipating data centers in space and SpaceX being able to carry the data centers up there. All right. Well, that's the time signature for this show when Elon Musk was a trillionaire. I don't know if he still is. I'm sure he has a tough time estimating his whole net worth within now tens of billions of dollars on any given day. David and Sarah, we are in the home stretch. So there's rapid fire, few comments left, then we'll ring off. Knight_YYZ_2 says, so you have a choice. Build your business in Canada and pay carbon tax and carbon capture and high industrial tax, or go to the U.S. and pay none of these. Where are you building, Brainiac? Sarah, you Brainiac, where are you going to build?
I like Brainiac as an insult.
He actually wrote Brainiac, showing himself not to be a brainiac or just a lazy speller.
Ooh.
Well, I mean, I got to say I'm a bad speller myself, so I have some sympathy for that. But I'll respond to the question with two observations. So one is the way that the industrial carbon pricing scheme actually works in Canada is that you get a lot of so-called essentially free credits. So the actual cost to a company is quite low. The idea is the marginal cost sends the signal. And the second is that, there's been a lot of work done on this. And so, Anton Deschênes-Lepretre back in 2019 looked for carbon leakage from the EU ETS to surrounding markets and basically found none, right? There are certainly some examples for very resource intensive sectors. And I think my point there would be, that has a limited run in a world that's working towards net zero. So if we end up losing a few of the most highest carbon things like cement, I don't want to say it doesn't matter. It matters. But when we think about building the economy overall, making sure that we're future-proofing it, is I think important. And then combined with that fact that actually in most, if not all cases in the EU version that they looked at, there wasn't leakage to, the surrounding countries that face lower environmental regulations.
It's interesting timing, given that the federal government is just rewriting the policy on industrial carbon pricing, in part because oil and gas executives told them to, and saying on the record it's hurting competitiveness. But of course, carbon price is just one line in a very long list of considerations of where you build. And Canada still has a bunch of advantages and other parts of that equation.
Yeah, and I have to make the point just because you brought it up, but I think to argue that for the oil sands is really absurd, right? Obviously, the development of oil sands themselves is not going to move to the U.S. because the oil sands aren't in the U.S. And the differences between developing a new project in the oil sands and developing a new project in oil somewhere else the fundamental differences are much more material than the cents on a barrel we're talking about in actual carbon costs.
I did have a very senior oil and gas industry investor tell me a couple of weeks ago, and on the Alberta separatism question, he said, listen, he's not a separatist. He was very clear about that. He's a federalist, but he said, if you're looking at it just myopically from what benefits the oil and gas sector, you would vote for separation every day, all day.
I'm surprised by that. I guess once again, we fail at rapid fire. But I think what that work I cited earlier showed is that decisions about where and, what makes companies economic are about way more than one cost input. And things like, governance and democracy and rule of law and, functioning systems are all incredibly important. So the idea that saving a few cents on the barrel because Alberta separates somehow makes up for, all of the massive other problems that it's going to create is kind of mind-blowing to me.
Hear, hear. Okay. We've got one on contrails. So we had Seb Eastman on the show in early January 2026. And part of that, we had a long conversation on contrails avoidance. And a couple people think that's nonsense. So we've got Dan 1958. He says, choosing what time you travel has no effect on airline schedules and thus has no effect on the climate. And Cookie Bob says, vapor trails reflecting the sunlight. Yeah, let's ban clouds at night next. David, I think this is right up your alley.
As it happens, I'm working on a popular book, and I was just writing some paragraphs on this, so I'm just going to read. High-flying jet aircraft often make contrails which might reasonably be called artificial cirrus clouds. Contrails can sometimes persist for days when the ice crystals in the contrails serve as seeds for a region of humid air that was already trying to form cirrus. Like cirrus clouds, contrails combine reflective cooling with infrared heating. Travel tip. This means you cause more warming on a night flight when there's no sunlight to reflect than if you do the same route during the daytime. So the answer is, unless one of these commentators lives in a world where the sun is the same day and night, they're just wrong. It's just really basic physics that the time of day matters because you only can reflect sunlight if there's sunlight there to reflect.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. And I would just refer people back to that show because I think Seb Eastman is one of the great academics on the topic. And we talk about how Canada, as part of its middle power, muscle flexing under Prime Minister Carney, could actually play an outsized role through its control of the Gander Oceanic Control Area airspace. And it's one agency that controls it. And we could really make a difference in climate if we flex those middle power muscles.
I got to say, this is one where I'm trying to wonder where these comments are coming from, if it's connected to some kind of conspiracy theories about chemtrails, because unlike some things we argue about, this seems like completely self-evident. Every listener has seen contrails from aircraft, and every listener can see that they're reflecting sunlight because that's why you see them. So they have to be reflecting some sunlight back to space. There's not much more to say.
Yeah, I don't know where it's coming from, but gave us something to talk about. So we're going to go, I think this is our last, this is our last one. And this is the old trope. Canada is only 2% of global emissions, so why do anything on climate? And I
have a simple answer.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm only 0.01% of Canmore's garbage problem for domestic garbage. So why shouldn't I just throw my domestic garbage on the street?
Yeah, I like that logic. Sarah?
Yeah, I'll take the top-down version and say, it's important to understand that these tropes are all part of a general discourse of climate delay and climate denial. And they continue to come up. As David said, you can explain away having to do anything by cutting the world up or into small enough pieces. And then the other thing that I would say is that there also is, I think, strong and emerging arguments now that simply acting as a free rider actually is no longer even good economic policy as well as things starts to change. But it certainly, I think, isn't in the ethos of Canada that, we as a nation would proudly stand up and say, we're just going to free ride on everybody else's efforts.
Yeah. And the weak point being moving from our share is too small to matter to therefore our action is meaningless. And listen, I think we have to acknowledge openly the disproportionate importance of the U.S. and China figuring out what to do on climate and reducing their emissions as the two largest emissions producing countries. But they're not going to move if everyone else says, oh, we're too small to matter and we're going to sit back. It's one of those things where collective action really does matter.
Yeah, and it's not as if we're out somehow as a leader on this, right? We already are quite a laggard with what we're actually doing compared to a lot of other regions. So.
Yep. And you're right. Just with the economic incentives, increasingly it's going to creep into trade.
I just want to come back to the basics of the moral case. I think all the things you guys said are true, but it is simply ludicrous and profoundly unethical under any ethical system I'm aware of to make the argument that says that if I'm proportional for only 1% of the bad, then because it's not much bad, I don't have to do anything. If people really applied that to their personal lives, the world would be a disaster.
Yeah. Being 2% of the problem doesn't make you 2% exempt from the consequences. And it doesn't make you 2% exempt for how you're going to be treated by other countries, including trading partners. If you enjoyed this episode, check out our Host in the Hot Seat episode, where EvC superfan Rob Tremblay turns the tables and interviews us. Also, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel for video versions and clips. Feel free to leave a comment on any of our content, on social media, or on your favorite podcast app. Clearly, we read them. Well, that's it for regularly scheduled programming for this season of Energy versus Climate. We'll be back in September with a brand new season of shows. And if you have ideas for show topics, well, send them along to info@energyversusclimate.com. That's info@energyvsclimate.com. In the meantime, keep an eye on the EvC feed. We'll be dropping some bonus content over the summer. And as always, thanks for listening. Without you, well, there'd be no EvC. Have a great summer.